Imagine Europe on the edge of fear and faith, the Middle East caught between empires, and a single speech powerful enough to send tens of thousands marching toward a land most had never seen. The Crusades did not begin with one battle or one enemy. They began with rumors, pilgrim tears, political ambition, and a promise of salvation. To understand how the Crusades actually started, we must go back to a world divided by belief, power, and desperation, where religion and politics became impossible to separate. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Europe was a land deeply shaped by faith, yet torn apart by constant instability. Christianity dominated everyday life, influencing how people thought about morality, death, and purpose, but political unity was almost non-existent. There was no strong central authority capable of enforcing peace across the continent. Instead, power was scattered among kings, dukes, counts, and local lords, each ruling their own territories and often fighting one another for land, prestige, and survival. Violence was not an exception, it was a way of life. The feudal system made this instability even worse. Loyalty flowed upward through personal bonds rather than national identity, meaning knights served individual lords, not a united kingdom. Disputes were often settled through warfare, raids, and private battles. Armored warriors roamed the countryside, burning villages and clashing with rivals, while ordinary people suffered the consequences. Europe was overflowing with trained fighters who knew only war, yet had no common cause to unite them or restrain their aggression. The Church stood out as the single institution that connected all of Christian Europe. From peasants to kings, nearly everyone accepted its spiritual authority. Bishops crowned rulers, monasteries preserved knowledge, and priests shaped moral behavior. Yet even the Church was struggling to control the chaos it witnessed. Clergy openly criticized the endless bloodshed between Christians, calling it sinful and destructive. Movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God tried to limit violence, but enforcement was weak and often ignored. At the same time, fear played a powerful role in shaping the European mindset. Disease, famine, and sudden death were common, and life expectancy was low. Many believed the end of the world could arrive at any moment. Salvation was the greatest concern of the medieval Christian, and sin was seen as a direct path to eternal punishment. This made people highly receptive to religious messages that promised forgiveness, redemption, and divine purpose. Knights, in particular, lived with a deep contradiction. They were trained to kill, yet taught that killing fellow Christians endangered their souls. This moral tension created guilt and anxiety among the warrior class. They needed a way to justify their violence, a cause that transformed bloodshed into something holy. Without realizing it, Europe was psychologically prepared for a religious war that would turn internal aggression outward. Meanwhile, the papacy was seeking to strengthen its influence. The Pope did not simply act as a spiritual leader, he was also a political figure competing with kings and emperors for authority. By guiding Europe toward a unified religious mission, the papacy could assert itself as the ultimate leader of Christendom. Ending internal conflict while expanding Christian power abroad was an incredibly tempting solution. All these forces, fragmented politics, constant warfare, deep religious devotion, fear of sin, and a powerful but restless church, created a volatile environment. Europe was like a loaded weapon, waiting for a single spark. When that spark finally came, it would channel centuries of violence, belief, and ambition into one of the most dramatic movements in world history, setting the stage for the Crusades to begin. By the early 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood as a shadow of its former greatness, still proud of its Roman heritage but increasingly fragile. Once the most powerful Christian state in the world, Byzantium had long acted as a protective wall between Europe and the rising powers of the East. Its cities were rich, its culture advanced, and its army disciplined. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, cracks were forming that would soon expose the empire to one of the greatest threats in its history. For centuries, Byzantium had relied on a careful balance of diplomacy, wealth, and military force to survive. It paid off enemies when needed, played rivals against one another, and used its professional army to defend key territories. However, this system depended on strong leadership. When capable emperors ruled, the empire held firm. When weak rulers took the throne, corruption, internal rivalries, and poor decisions slowly drained its strength. The real danger emerged with the rise of the Seljuk Turks, a powerful and highly mobile Muslim force moving westward from Central Asia. Unlike earlier enemies, the Seljuks were skilled horse archers and fearless warriors driven by both conquest and faith. They did not simply raid Byzantine lands, they aimed to settle, govern, and dominate them. As they advanced into Anatolia, the very heartland that supplied Byzantium with soldiers and food began to fall apart. The situation reached a breaking point in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert. What should have been a decisive Byzantine victory turned into a catastrophic defeat. Due to betrayal, poor coordination, and overconfidence, the imperial army collapsed. Emperor Romanos IV was captured, an unthinkable humiliation for a ruler who claimed Roman authority. Although he was later released, the damage was irreversible. Anatolia, once firmly Byzantine, was now open to Turkish control. This loss was not just territorial, it was psychological. Towns fell one by one, trade routes were disrupted, and Christian populations fled westward. The empire struggled to recruit soldiers because its main recruitment lands were gone. Without Anatolia, Byzantium could no longer defend itself as it once had. Constantinople itself began to feel vulnerable, a fear that had not existed for centuries. When Alexios Komnenos became emperor, he inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. Surrounded by enemies and lacking manpower, he realized that traditional methods would no longer work. Reluctantly, he turned to Western Europe for help. This was a dramatic step, as relations between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church were deeply strained after the Great Schism of 1054. Alexios did not ask for a massive holy war. He requested trained mercenaries to help reclaim lost territory. Yet this plea would be transformed as it traveled west. What began as a political and military crisis for Byzantium became the spark that ignited the Crusades, changing the fate of not only the empire but the entire medieval world. For centuries before the Crusades, Jerusalem had lived under Muslim rule, and contrary to later myths, this was not originally a land of constant religious persecution. After the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, Christian holy sites were largely preserved, churches remained standing, and pilgrims from Europe were usually allowed to visit. Islamic rulers understood Jerusalem's spiritual importance and governed it as a sacred city shared by multiple faiths. For a long time, coexistence, though imperfect, was the norm rather than the exception. However, distance shaped perception. For most Europeans, the Holy Land was not a real place but an idea formed by sermons, stories, and scripture. Very few people could travel thousands of miles to see conditions for themselves. What they believed came from returning pilgrims, traveling monks, and church leaders who interpreted events through a religious lens. Even minor incidents in Jerusalem could be magnified into tales of widespread suffering once they reached Western Europe. The situation began to change in the 10th and 11th centuries as political instability increased across the Islamic world. Different Muslim dynasties fought for control of Jerusalem, and authority shifted frequently. During periods of unrest, pilgrims sometimes faced higher taxes, harassment, or danger on the roads. While these problems were often temporary and local, they fueled fear among Christians who already viewed the Muslim world as religiously other. One event that deeply shocked Christian Europe was the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. Although the church was later rebuilt and relations improved, the memory of this act lingered for decades. It became a powerful symbol used by church leaders to portray Muslim rule as hostile and sacrilegious, even when reality had become more stable again. Pilgrimage itself played a crucial role in escalating tension. Traveling to Jerusalem was seen as a sacred act that could cleanse sins and bring spiritual prestige. When pilgrims returned with stories of hardship, whether real, exaggerated, or misunderstood, their words carried immense emotional weight. These accounts spread from village to village, creating a shared sense of humiliation and loss among people who had never left Europe. Church leaders did not invent these stories, but they selectively emphasized them. In sermons and religious gatherings, the Holy Land was described as a place of suffering Christians and endangered sacred sites. Jerusalem was no longer just a city, it became a symbol of Christendom itself, imagined as being held captive by non-believers. This emotional framing prepared the public mind for the idea that reclaiming the city was not aggression, but duty. By the time Pope Urban II called for the Crusade, the ground was already fertile. Generations of fear, rumor, and religious storytelling had transformed political instability in Jerusalem into a moral crisis for Europe. The Holy City was no longer distant geography, it was a wounded heart of Christianity. When the call to defend it finally came, millions felt as if history, faith, and destiny were demanding a response. By the middle of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer the unshakable power it once had been. For centuries, it had acted as the eastern shield of Christianity, protecting Europe from invasions coming from Asia. But internal corruption, court politics, and weakening military discipline slowly eroded its strength. Emperors changed rapidly, generals plotted against each other, and the army, once professional and loyal, became unreliable. This decline made the empire vulnerable at the very moment a new and powerful enemy was rising in the east. That enemy was the Seljuk Turks, a dynamic and fast-moving force that had recently converted to Islam. Unlike earlier Muslim rulers, the Seljuks were aggressive expansionists. They moved swiftly across Persia and into Byzantine-controlled lands, raiding cities and disrupting trade routes. Their cavalry tactics overwhelmed traditional Byzantine defenses, and their advance into Anatolia, the heartland of the empire, posed an existential threat. Anatolia was not just territory, it was the empire's main source of soldiers, food, and tax revenue. The crisis reached its breaking point in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV personally led a large Byzantine army to stop the Seljuk advance. Confident but politically isolated, he marched east with troops that were divided by loyalty and weakened by internal betrayal. During the battle, confusion spread across the Byzantine ranks. Some commanders deliberately withdrew their forces, leaving the emperor exposed. The Seljuks, led by Sultan Alp Arslan, seized the opportunity and crushed the Byzantine army. Romanos IV was captured alive, an event almost unimaginable for a Byzantine emperor. Although he was later released, the psychological damage was done. News of the defeat sent shockwaves throughout the empire. In the chaos that followed, rival claimants to the throne fought for power, plunging Byzantium into civil war. While the empire fought itself, the Seljuk Turks advanced freely, occupying most of Anatolia with little resistance. Cities fell one after another, and Byzantine authority collapsed across the region. This loss was catastrophic. Anatolia had been the backbone of Byzantine survival for centuries, and without it, the empire was bleeding to death. Constantinople itself now seemed vulnerable. Refugees flooded westward, telling stories of destruction and fear. The empire no longer had the manpower or resources to reverse its losses alone. The reality became painfully clear. Byzantium could not survive without outside help. When Alexios I Komnenos came to the throne in 1081, he inherited a broken empire. Intelligent and pragmatic, Alexios understood that traditional solutions were no longer enough. He needed soldiers, experienced, heavily armed soldiers, and he needed them fast. Turning to Western Europe, once viewed with suspicion and superiority, became a necessity rather than a choice. This was a dramatic shift in Byzantine thinking, born out of desperation. Alexios did not initially ask for a massive holy war. His request to the West was limited and practical, trained mercenaries to help reclaim lost territory. But when his appeal reached the Pope and the rulers of Western Christendom, it took on a life of its own. What began as a desperate cry for military assistance after Manzikert would soon ignite a movement far larger than Alexios ever imagined, one that would reshape the medieval world and mark the true beginning of the Crusades. By the late 11th century, Pope Urban II stood at a critical crossroads in history. The papacy had grown stronger, but it was still competing with kings, emperors, and rival religious authorities for influence. Urban understood that his power did not come from armies or wealth, but from belief. When the Byzantine emperor's request for military help reached Rome, Urban immediately recognized that this was not just a plea for soldiers, it was a rare chance to reshape the balance of power in the Christian world. For decades, the Christian Church had been divided by deep internal conflict. The Great Schism of 1054 had split Christianity into Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, leaving wounds of mistrust and rivalry. Rome claimed spiritual leadership, while Constantinople resisted Western authority. By answering the Byzantine call for help, Urban saw a way to position himself as the supreme leader of all Christians, both East and West, and possibly heal, or dominate, the fractured church. At the same time, Europe itself was in chaos. Knights fought endless private wars, villages burned, and innocent people suffered under feudal violence. The Church had tried to stop this bloodshed through religious laws like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, but with limited success. Urban realized that he could not eliminate violence, but he could redirect it. Instead of Christians killing Christians, he could send Europe's warriors toward a distant, external enemy. Urban also understood the power of symbolism. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was the heart of Christian faith, the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Though it had been under Muslim rule for centuries, framing its situation as a crisis made it a powerful emotional weapon. By linking the defense of Eastern Christians with the liberation of holy places, Urban could unite faith, fear, and duty into a single, irresistible call. Politically, the moment was perfect. Western Europe had a surplus of fighting men, younger sons with no inheritance, and nobles hungry for land and glory. Urban knew that offering them a sacred mission would strengthen the Church's authority over kings and lords. Those who answered the call would fight under God's banner, not under a single monarch, making the Pope the spiritual commander of the greatest military movement Europe had ever seen. Urban was careful in how he framed the conflict. He did not present it as conquest, but as defense. Christians in the East were portrayed as suffering and helpless, holy sites as violated, and the Muslim enemy as brutal and threatening. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories spread quickly and ignited outrage. In a deeply religious society, protecting fellow believers was not optional, it was a moral obligation. In Pope Urban II's vision, the Crusade became far more than military aid to Byzantium. It was a grand strategy to unite Europe, expand papal authority, heal a divided church on Rome's terms, and transform war into a holy act. What began as a political calculation soon evolved into a sacred mission that no ruler, knight, or peasant could easily ignore. With one decision, Urban set in motion a force that would march across continents and shape history for centuries to come. In 1095, Europe gathered at a small town in France called Clermont, unaware that this meeting would ignite one of the most transformative movements in medieval history. Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles, clergy, and common people at the Council of Clermont, facing a continent restless with violence and spiritual anxiety. Europe's knights were locked in endless feuds, villages suffered from constant warfare, and the Church struggled to control the bloodshed. Urban understood that he needed more than authority, he needed a cause powerful enough to unite fractured Christendom under a single sacred mission. As Pope Urban II began to speak, he carefully shaped a narrative that blended fear, duty, and divine purpose. He spoke of Christians in the East who were suffering under Muslim rule, describing acts of cruelty and desecration of holy places. While many of these accounts were exaggerated or selectively told, they were effective. Urban was not simply sharing information, he was awakening emotion. By portraying Eastern Christians as helpless victims, he created a moral obligation for Western Europe to act, turning distant political struggles into a deeply personal religious crisis. Urban then shifted his focus to Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of Christianity. He described it as a sacred land polluted and dishonored, a place where Christ had lived, died, and risen. To medieval Christians, Jerusalem was not just a city, it was a symbol of salvation itself. By framing the conflict as a fight to protect and reclaim holy ground, Urban transformed war into an act of devotion. Taking up arms was no longer sinful violence, it became a sacred journey, a pilgrimage with swords. The most revolutionary moment of Urban's speech came with his promise of spiritual reward. He declared that anyone who joined this holy expedition would receive full forgiveness of sins. For a society deeply obsessed with salvation and the fear of hell, this offer was extraordinary. Knights who had spent their lives killing could now believe that their violence would cleanse their souls, rather than condemn them. This promise erased moral hesitation and replaced it with certainty, turning faith into the most powerful weapon of all. Urban also used the Crusade as a solution to Europe's